So I started out in photography 6 years ago. I started photographing New York City with a broken point and shoot. I grew up really poor. I was pretty poor in my 20s. There's a whole backstory out there online. I'm not going to belabor this presentation with it. But I just started shooting whatever was around me at the time that I could shoot with the broken camera that I could afford, which was $79. And eventually, due to some funny circumstances, ended up putting the photos online. And it snowballed into a career and a book and all kinds of very wonderful opportunities, such as also becoming a Sony Artisan of Imagery, which is who I'm here with today, Sony. So primarily, what I fell in love with shooting while I was shooting New York was photographing New York City in the snow at night. I would often walk up to about 7 miles in the snow just to capture the mood that I was looking for, and also just to share with people how I viewed New York. So I wasn't specifically concerned with reality. I was more concerned with how I could show people how I perceived the reality around me. And through a lot of trial and error and not having a lot of money, I got super into editing, fell in love with the process of shooting and the process of getting those special moments in the snow, in blizzards, at night when nobody else was really around. And there was something very rewarding about it. And I was fortunate enough to turn it into a career. So where does this lead me to speaking about an astronaut? So last year, astronaut Commander Hadfield, who, if many of you don't know who he is one of the astronauts who's walked in space. He's been on the International Space Station, and he also got really well known in the US for playing guitar on the International Space Station and doing a cover of David Bowie's Space Oddity, which got something like, I don't know, 37 million views or something wild like that. So Commander Hadfield made a post on Facebook, and he just literally said, I'm looking for 10 people who are artists, filmmakers, scientists, writers, musicians. I'm looking for these people to come with me on a trip to the Arctic for a period of time, and you'll be on a Soviet-era icebreaker. Who's in? And by the time I saw the post, it was pretty funny. That's him on the International Space Station doing his thing. There were like 500 comments, and the people that were getting suggested were people that I look up to in filmmaking and in the online space. And I thought, I literally have no chance of getting chosen for something like this. But I made a comment very briefly, and I said, you know, I shoot New York in the snow. I love it. The top 3 dream destinations that I've always wanted to go to are the Arctic, the Antarctic, and Siberia, because I really want to explore the themes that I'm trying to capture in New York in these other places that I've dreamed about going. And I really thought nothing of it. I went to a client meeting actually that night for a photography shoot, didn't have access to the internet, came home around midnight, and I had a message on my page from his son, Evan, saying, whenever you get this, can you please give me a call? I am Chris Hadfield's son. So when you get a message saying, I'm Chris Hadfield's son, can you give me a call? Even if it's midnight, you call. And I called. And he just simply asked what my backstory was. He said he had looked at my site. He was really intrigued by it. And I said, how much time do you have? I've got a wacky, backstory. He said, well, I'm walking my dog, so you have all the time in the world. And so I spent 40 minutes telling him all about everything in my life up to that point. And at the end of the call, he said, you're the last person we just chose to go to the Arctic with us. And so it was a pretty surreal moment. So the trip would be on a Soviet-era icebreaker called the Kapitan Klebnikov, It's been in operation since the Soviet era icebreaker. And it's a working crew vessel. It primarily is used for mining in Siberia, but also various expedition companies rent it out to go on trips around the Antarctic or the Arctic. And so for this expedition, it was going to be for 18 days. It was going to be with 10 strangers, so none of us knew each other, and one astronaut, on this Russian crew-operated science vessel with zero connectivity. There isn't a lot of connectivity in the Arctic due to the cables, and they've been working on the infrastructure for a while, but it just doesn't ethically exist up there for people to freely use. So we would have no access to the internet, no TV, no phone. So it was pretty daunting, pretty overwhelming. And the mission was not to go there and make a documentary about global warming. I feel like that's the first question I get every time I talk about this. It actually was literally just to make art and to do whatever it is that we felt inspired to do while there. So he had chosen a musician, for example, and the musician opted to write an entire album while we were on the ship. So I didn't really actually even know what I was gonna do going into it because I felt super overwhelmed. You know, I grew up here in New York City. I had zero experience shooting in any kind of extreme environment in an adventure setting. And it was a pretty daunting mission. So again, since we were on an icebreaker, there were some obvious issues with gear that we could bring. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the title of this presentation, because I'm sure if you guys saw it, you're curious maybe a little bit about why I said I only brought one camera. So initially, because we were taking a cargo plane to Greenland to go onto the icebreaker, and the icebreaker cannot dock near the shore since it's an icebreaker and it has a shallow hull, we were very limited in the amount of gear that we could bring. So initially, I think the gear restriction was like 45 pounds for all of our clothing plus, electronic gear. So that includes this old heavy laptop of mine that I still had at the time, my camera, hard drive, that kind of stuff. I mean, if you guys travel with camera gear, you know how heavy things can get when you're traveling, never mind clothing. The lucky thing was that the expedition crew was going to provide us with adventure gear. So we would have access to parkas that we could use, which obviously saved on weight, as well as waterproof muck boots, since we would be in the Arctic waters as well. So I decided, you know what? This is a perfect time to stand by something I've said in so many other presentations that I've given, which is that if I could have my dream set up, it would be one camera and one lens, because I actually really despise traveling with a lot of equipment. I like to be in the moment, and I don't like to think too much about, jostling around and changing lenses and doing all that sort of thing. So I thought, what can I bring with me that will let me shoot exactly what I want to shoot while also giving me the confidence? So I brought with me the Sony a7R II. The Sony a7R II is a mirrorless camera. It shoots really beautiful, extremely large files. And I knew that the photos that I would be shooting would be in an art gallery show at the Art Gallery of Toronto. So I wanted to make sure that what I was going to shoot was going to be large enough for display and for whatever else the photos would be used for. And then I brought my one lens, which was the G Master 24-70 f2.8. As I said, I'm not a wildlife shooter. I'm sure this would be a very different conversation if I was a wildlife shooter. The truth is that the Arctic is a little bit different than the Antarctic. The Arctic doesn't have quite a lot of wildlife that's roaming around. It doesn't have penguins, sadly. So for me, as somebody who shoots wide, expansive cityscapes normally, as well as landscapes, I was fine with shooting 24 to 70. And then I brought a little filter that I could rotate on the camera. I didn't want to be inhibited by some weird, clunky, archaic filter system because that annoys me as well. I wanted something simple, so it's actually a video filter. Highly recommend it. It's great. You basically just twist it to adjust it, and it's amazing. So I had that. I brought some batteries, 2 hard drives, and myself, and a lot of inner layers that were wool, basically. And this is a picture of the A7R II. I try to include my cat in every presentation that I do because she's an integral part of my art. So the first issue, obviously, that I knew I was going to encounter was that we were going to have some really unusual shooting situations. So not only was I going to be on a Russian-operated crew vessel, and that's pretty much the opposite of luxury, right? But I was also going pretty close to the North Pole through ice. So I knew it was going to be a little wild. The other thing that I had to get over very quickly were a lot of fears. I have a lot of anxiety, and one of the fears I've been grappling with for my whole life is a fear of heights. And also fear of small boats. So was this the journey for me? The very first thing that we did when we got to the shore at Greenland at Kangerlussuaq was we had to get into a small Zodiac and go to the icebreaker, which had a floating little staircase up to the ship. So that was fun. But also, in addition to that, as you can see, we were in helicopters every single day. So in the afternoons, we would basically go on helicopters that took off from the ship. It was all very James Bond. And then we would go to very remote locations in the helicopter, get out, hike a little bit. So in addition to the whole height thing and having to get over my fear of heights because I was in a helicopter so many times, the other thing was that we were very active. So when I was actually out and about, we were hiking anywhere from 2 hours to about 5 hours in Arctic conditions with, as you can see, pretty heavy kind of parkas that we were wearing. This is a picture of one of the Zodiacs. We were literally going through ice. It was definitely a trial by fire or ice, for sure. I don't know if any of you have been in a Zodiac. I highly recommend it. Now that I've gotten over my fear of it, it's actually quite a lovely way to travel when you're in an environment like this. And I highly suggest any of you, if you ever get the opportunity in your lifetime to travel to the Arctic or the Antarctic and really get a feel for what these environments feel like in person. And so, as I said, when we were on helicopters, they would just basically drop us off at these locations where there were no other people that had never really had people there. It was one of the most wildest things. So as a photographer, a lot of the things that I had to grapple with were, physically, I really couldn't have been carrying a ton of gear at all times. Because we were hiking so much and because of the conditions where we're running to and from helicopters or getting in and out of Zodiacs. And so that was one of the biggest issues that I faced. This picture, for example, I actually had a panic attack, and I've talked about this in other presentations, but we basically were hiking up a mountain. It was near the North Pole. This is a location that you can actually ski to the North Pole from. And we were trying to do a hike all the way up Mount Timea. And I was with Commander Hadfield, and I was like, cool, I could do this. The man is an exceptional human being. He's an astronaut. He's in peak physical form. Needless to say, that did not happen for me. But the views were beautiful when I was coming down. And kind of going back, and I ended up going across the water in a Zodiac to another part, which was super magical. So the other issue that I came across was variable weather and light conditions. And like when I'm speaking about this, I realize that this is like a super esoteric bucket list trip that I'm talking about. You know, I don't think I'm ever going to have another trip like this in my lifetime. And I knew that when I was on this trip. But I think that a lot of the issues that I kind of came across are similar issues that I've come across here when I shoot in New York City, and also in different, more accessible areas of the world and more affordable areas of the world that I've traveled to. So just in case you're all wondering how I'm wrapping this up into something that's a little bit more relatable, it would be that a lot of these, while they're really magical things to illustrate, there are a lot of issues that I think we grapple with as photographers and creators when we go outside and shoot anything, no matter where we're shooting. So the variable weather and light was a huge issue. We went on the trip in September, so we were at the end of the midnight sun, which is something else that I'd never experienced. And so because we were traveling up through the Northwest Passage, essentially we ran into a lot of different storm systems and a lot of pretty rocky water and weather conditions that were really interesting to shoot as a photographer. So we would go from scenes like this to this within a matter of like 20 minutes, which I think really led to the sort of magical feel of the entire journey, because while I was standing on the flybridge on the ship, you know, I basically had to know that what I was using to shoot these landscapes could handle everything that I was shooting. And that's where the little fader filter really helped. So for example, with this photo, I would have never been able to capture the clouds if I didn't have the fader filter on the lens. And also the dynamic range of the camera really helped as well. It helps to kind of pick up all that beautiful detail of the mountains and the ice that was floating by and that really cool sunset that doesn't really set. And so when I was talking about going down from Mount Timea, this was another example of where the weather started out looking like this. This was about, I think, 6 or 7 in the morning, and then it immediately turned into this. So the sunrise looked like that, but this was like right before sunrise. So there were a lot of very variable sorts of light, variable terrain, lots of things where I really couldn't think too much about the gear that I had. So I needed to really just know that what I had, I would be able to capture what it is that I was trying to capture. And I think that really brings me to my main point, which goes for anything, in travel, in shooting cities, in shooting people, wildlife, whatever. I really truly believe that artistic freedom occurs when the gear that you use allows your imagination to run wild and uninhibited. If we think too much about the gear that we're using, that's what we're doing. We're thinking about the gear. We're not thinking about being in the moment, and we're not thinking about maybe what we're trying to capture out of the moment. So I think it's important to let yourself be and dream and not let gear overtake that process. And you know, not really being inhibited really allowed me to get some special moments. I mean, I always had my camera with me, even when I was on the ship and it was like 2 in the morning. So this was actually 2 in the morning. What happens with midnight sun, for anybody who's never experienced it, is that the sun doesn't really truly set, but you're kind of bathed in this really beautiful twilight for, I would say, 4 or 5 hours. And it's really beautiful. So even at moments like 2 in the morning when I'm just standing outside trying to enjoy things, it was really great to be able to capture that moment and then share it later and try to explain what I was feeling in the moment. This area was really, really special. This was Tanqueray Ford. It's actually in the northern part of Canada, and it's at 85 degrees latitude, which is all the way up by the North Pole. It's another area where you can ski to the North Pole from or take dog sleds, as many people do. And this was another moment where the sky just sort of opened up. And because we were there in September and we were there right before the first snow fell, the ground is what actually shows the colors of autumn. So when you get above a certain line in the Arctic, you don't have trees that grow really high. A lot of the vegetation that's on the ground takes sometimes 10,000 years just to get that big. So some of these, plants that are in this landscape here even are thousands of years old, and that's the height that they're going to get. They're at max height. So it was kind of interesting to find that shift in perspective. Growing up here in New York, autumn is one of my favorite seasons, and I always think of autumn as this amazing season where there's trees above me and there's all these colors. But here in the Arctic, it was a completely different atmosphere where autumn was on the ground. And then, of course, since we were on an icebreaker, we broke through a lot of ice, quite a bit. We started in Greenland, we moved up, and then we went through the Northwest Passage, and we hit a lot of ice once we got to the Canadian High Arctic, which is the area of the Arctic that is in Canada. And it was really magical to not, again, be overwhelmed with thinking about gear, since I only had the one camera and the one lens, because I could just shoot what it is that I wanted to shoot without overthinking it and fumbling around and missing a moment. Because as we were going, we were actually moving at this point when I took this photo. We would move pretty fast through the ice, and there was a lot of movement, because when the icebreaker actually crushes through ice, it's kind of like, imagine what a truck sounds like times 50, and you're also getting jostled quite a bit. So being able to know that even though we were moving, I could capture the detail that I captured in something like this, as well as the colors, which were just stunning. I never knew in my life that ice reflected so many different colors of greens and blues, and it was quite magical. This was taken on one of those adventure trips where I talked about how I couldn't have possibly had a ton of gear. We went up in a helicopter, and we went to this part, and I think at this point in time, we did a calculation. We were with a bunch of scientists and statisticians as well, and we calculated that we were only of 250 people who were in that part of the earth at that time, because there's basically nobody living all the way up there. This is also near the North Pole. And I couldn't have had a lot of gear with me because we were doing the helicopter there, and then we did a hike around this area. So I couldn't have been really encumbered with a lot while running to the helicopter, getting in the helicopter, because those things happen fast. Running out of the helicopter and then hiking around. So it really helped to kind of have this super light setup and be happy with what I had. This was actually taken from the helicopter. This was a sunset. Although I should say it was sunset, but because it was midnight sun, the sun doesn't ever fully go down. So this is where the sun gets to the lowest point in the horizon, and it just sort of sits there for the majority of the night. But it was beautiful to get that vantage point from the helicopter, even though I didn't really I was no expert at shooting from a helicopter. Obviously, I'd never been in one prior to the trip. So yeah. And then this was taken, it's so not me doing that, by the way. I'm not even moving. Not moving. Okay. It's my hair. Okay. I knew my hair would get me in trouble. So this was taken at a really incredible UNESCO site that's actually in Greenland. So this was earlier on in the trip. This is the first time I'd ever actually seen a glacier, not an iceberg. So an iceberg is the thing that breaks off from a glacier. The glacier is the thing that births an iceberg. This is actually the spot where the iceberg was born that took down the Titanic, because it's the birthplace of glaciers, birthplace of icebergs. So it's a really hallowed ground. This is actually Evan Hadfield standing there. People always ask if I asked him to stand like that. I did. He was actually like trying to hike back up to me, and I was like, can you just stand there for like another 2 minutes? But it was a really magical spot. And again, if you can see the rocks that are in the foreground in this composition, I mean, it was quite a bit of a hike, actually. I would say this was like maybe a 2-hour hike to get to the top, to get to the vantage point where we were. So again, being light with gear on an adventure expedition really does help. You know, I think when people go on these trips, they're obviously bucket list trips. You know, it's a trip of a lifetime. It's something that people save up a lot of money to do. It's something that's really treasured, and people want to make sure that they're going to capture every single bit of it, which is totally understandable. But at the same time, it also helps for you to have more mobility, to appreciate what you're actually seeing. Because if you're too encumbered by gear, sometimes you're not able to go to those super high vantage points or hike around a lot or get to those really cool spots where you can actually capture a cool image of maybe some kind of wildlife that you see. And so this is where I'm going to soft end my presentation. I don't really want to talk for an hour because I think that that's a little bit silly. I would rather answer questions for anybody who has any. But I'm going to finish with this story. And it's a perfect illustration, again, of why I was happy I only had one camera and one lens. So this polar bear, we were on the ship for 18 days, and this was day 16. And we had polar bear sightings. So I don't know if any of you have been to either polar region, but apparently this is a really funny thing that happens. There's always sightings of things, and they look like little pixels on the horizon. And so it kind of became a joke that every time they would announce, you know, on the ship, oh, there's a muskox sighting, we would just be like, oh, okay, great, another pixel on the horizon, woo! Because you can't really see anything. They're usually so far away. But on day 16, we were eating dinner, and our ship was actually in an ice kind of barricade. Like, we were trying to break through ice, and the captain had stopped for a second because he was trying to figure out how to not do that. Because even though you're in an icebreaker, you don't want to like maximally break through ice. If you can, you're always going to try to go around it or go through the path of least resistance. So we had actually stopped, so it was pretty thick ice, and somebody noticed that there was a polar bear walking up to the ship because we were basically in the ice. And so we all basically got up really quietly, so we didn't make any noise. We couldn't even run, and we kind of tiptoed to the side of the ship. And it was maybe one of the most touching experiences I've ever had, because the polar bear had really we had a polar bear specialist with us. So according to her, the polar bear really looked as if it had never seen humans before. And it was super curious, and it walked right up to the ship. And so we were all kind of like hanging over there, and most of us were crying. I was like bawling my eyes out. And I had my camera, and I'm like, whoa, I'm seeing a polar bear. But it was super magical, and he just sort of like, sniffed at the ship, looked at us really weird, like, what is this new specimen of animal to eat? And, it was a really once-in-a-lifetime experience. And so if you recall, I had a 24 to 70 lens. I didn't have a wildlife lens. I didn't have any of that wonderful stuff that people have that's so giant and bulky. And so I took this photo. I think I actually shot it at like 35 because I was so freaked out that we were seeing a polar bear. Like, in that moment, you're not really thinking about, God, I got to get it at 70. You're just kind of like, what? There's a polar bear right there. So I think I shot it at 35. But later on when I came home, because the camera shoots at such high megapixel, I was able to crop it into this. And you still have all of the detail, which is like ridiculous to me. Like, I'm still wowed by technology at this point. But yeah, I want to end it there because I think it kind of goes along with my entire theme of this, which is that, you know, ultimately as photographers, we want to capture something special. But at the same time, we want to experience that and be in the moment and kind of understand what it's like to be human in that moment and have that connection. So that when we look back at a photo like this, you know, when I look back at this, I feel what it felt like to be standing there and to look him right into the eyes, you know, and to have that incredible connection and kind of the weight of everything we had just seen with the ice melting and all the other heavy stuff that we experienced. And, you know, I think that there's something to be said about that. So rather than, you know, constantly thinking about, oh my God, when am I going to get my next, you know, that next shot? When am I going to get my next thing? Also kind of try to think about how you can minimize your gear and get the best gear that's going to be able to help you capture what it is that you want to capture while also experiencing what you're experiencing.